So no, it's a real dangerous game.
Is it a problem like the term critical race theory it's open to interpretation?
Yeah, well, it's often even hard, except in retrospect, to understand a lot of what these things actually are, because new clouds of ideas emerge and they kind of have an animating spirit, and they have a set of associated, what would you say, presumptions, and you can often only see what that is in retrospect. It took me a long time to understand whatever existentialism was enough to sort of define it, phenomenology, these different schools of thought that occupied the thoughts of psychological investigators over a couple of centuries, postmodernism, modernism. It's not an easy thing to extract out the gist of those and define them. Plus, as I said, they have very fuzzy boundaries. So,
well, what I saw with DeSantis was he had a concern that it wasn't just Black history that they were putting into this critical race theory, but that he saw that there was queer theory, which was in this thing that they were teaching in school. And like, how does that have anything to do with Black history? Like, why is queer theory inserted?
Yeah, well, I think the way those are linked is essentially through what you might regard as, well, it's implicit Marxism, but it's even deeper than Marxism. So if you're a Marxist, you have a heuristic that simplifies the world, and that heuristic is that you can understand any social relationship from an intimate relationship all the way up to the state by just dividing the parties, let's call them the narrative partners in a discussion or an interaction, into those who are oppressed and victimized and those who are taking advantage of them and profiting. That's basic Marxist theory of economics. And there's obviously some truth in that, because when systems become corrupt, that's how they operate, right? It's exploitation and victimization. And every system tends towards corruption. And so, and if your eyes are open a little bit, or if you're, let's call it, if you've moved from naivety to cynicism, then you can see every interaction as a power dynamic. And then that drives, as soon as you have that established, that idea that the basic relationship is one of power, well, then you can see, well, there's no difference between what's happened to queer people in relationship to those in power and what's happened to Black people in relationship to those in power. But it's united by that underlying, that's why I always make a case for the domination of something like postmodernism and Marxism. I've been criticized for that, but I think it's an accurate association. The postmodernists figured out, and they were right about this, that we see the world through a story. Now, that turns out to be something unbelievably complicated, and I think all the top-end neuroscientists like Carl Friston are, what would you call, converging on this presumption that you have to see the world through a story. And the postmodernists actually figured that out, the French postmodernists, Foucault and Derrida and people like that. But then they did something that was a sleight of hand. And this all happened in the 1970s. They said, well, we have to see the world through a story. And even if you're a scientist, you're not exactly objective, because there's a narrative driving your work that you might be unaware of. That's your implicit narrative. That's what might be implicitly biasing you. But they jumped to the conclusion that the underlying narrative was one of power. It's basically that all human relationships are predicated on power. And, there isn't a more cynical viewpoint than that. And it's easy to take apart, if you think about it for a moment, in a practical sense. If your marriage is just based on power, first of all, it's an unpleasant place because it's tyrant and slave. And second, good luck with that, because people aren't that easy to tyrannize. Maybe you have a willing slave in your wife, but I doubt it. If you're just trying to play power games with her, she's going to fight back with everything she's got. And then if you have friends, that's a relationship of mutual exploitation, is it? Then you're just a bully with henchmen. And they're going to stab you in the back the first chance they get.
You're a mob then.
You're
a mob leader.
Yeah. Well, worse than that even.
A dictator.
Yeah. You're a dictator. And people say, well, look at how successful dictator psychopaths can be. But I look at them and I think, that's your definition of success.
Yeah, what is success? I mean, how are you
the biggest devil
fulfilled?
In hell.
Yeah, are you happy?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
well, the leader of a bad place might be the person who's worst off. In some fundamental sense, right? They're the most corrupt.
Isn't that funny though, that the way we define success is power and money? Those are you look how successful they are.
Yeah.
Power and money, but a complete absence of love and trust and respect and
Yeah, well, it's,
Basic
you
human
know,
dignity.
well, it's also not really how people operate. So there's an anthropological literature on the formation of elders in say, traditional societies, because you might ask yourself, you know, who becomes an elder? And if you were a Marxist cynic, you'd say, well, those who used exploitation to dominate, like the priestly class or something like that. And that goes along with the supposition that, you know, religion is the opiate of the masses. And some of that's obviously true, but a lot of it isn't. The elders aren't that at all. They're the people who others go to spontaneously to ask for counsel.
Yeah.
And then you ask, well, who do people naturally gravitate towards for counsel? And the answer is, well, productive, generous people who've managed their interpersonal relationships well. Because who the hell else would you go ask for advice if you had any sense? Like you might go ask the local dictator and kowtow to him if you need a favor to take somebody out. But if you're actually asking for counsel, you're going to ask someone who's decent and who's generous and who plays a reciprocal game. It's also the case, this is worth knowing too, the problem with a power game is that it's not playable, not in the final analysis. So Frans de Waal, the Dutch primatologist, has showed even pretty clearly in chimpanzees, you know, you think the roughest, toughest chimpanzee rules the damn roost and he pounds everybody flat and he gets access to the females. And there's a little bit of truth to that because female chimps aren't sexually choosy, but the male chimps will chase weaker males away from them. And so if you are more powerful physically as a male chimp, you do have preferential mating access. But the problem with being a brute, even if you're a chimp, is that you have an off day and two of the chimps that you oppress band together and tear you into pieces. And so what de Waal found was that in chimp troops, the stable alpha can sometimes even be the smallest male of the troop. He'll ally himself with some of the dominant females and makes networks that are essentially friendships, reciprocal friendships. And that gives him a stable position, not of power, but of authority. And that's definitely the case in functional human societies. It's not based on power. Now, it's tricky because if it degenerates, then it degenerates into a relationship of power. You know, and so that means that critics who make the claim that everything's about power are right in some sense when they're talking about nothing but corruption, but they're really 100% seriously wrong about the idea that it's power relation that constitutes the basis for the organization of any social interaction. You know, it doesn't work in your marriage, doesn't work with your friends, doesn't work with your children, doesn't work with your business partners, doesn't work with your customers. It doesn't work with politicians, although here's another twist that's complicated. So imagine you have a population of people who basically cooperate reciprocally. So, you know, I do you a favor, you do me one, and maybe we figure out how to advance each other across time. That's a good game, right? Fair trade plus advancement. That's a good definition for a good marriage. Okay, but now you have a community of people like that together. Okay, now it opens up an ecological niche, and the niche is psychopathy. And the psychopath comes in and pretends that he's a productive, generous reciprocator, but he's not. He's just an instrumental manipulator. But he can get away with it because there's enough wealth generated by the cooperators, you know, the honest cooperators, so that there's a space for someone to exploit the system. And that stabilizes that 4% of the population. So, you know, across the world, 4% of people are close enough to clinically diagnosable psychopath. And that's probably better than being, you know, paralyzed by fear and anxiety and just staying in your bed. Better in terms of reproductive success, let's say, and maybe even success in general. But it's not a good game because in the real world, most psychopaths get found out pretty quickly. So, you know, you can screw somebody once and maybe twice, but then you figure it out and then word gets around. And so in the real world, two things happen. Psychopaths have to be itinerant so they can find new people to exploit. And the other thing that happens is generally non-psychopathic males who are fairly aggressive keep the psychopaths under control. So part of the reason that women like men who have some capacity for aggression, but who are still productive and reciprocal, is that men who are productive and reciprocal, who have some capacity for aggression, can keep the real monsters at bay. So it's hard on women. They have to navigate that really thin line between productive generosity and the capacity for aggression. That's a really tough thing to navigate. That's basically the story of Beauty and the Beast, the Disney movie, right? And the Beast is someone capable of aggression, but he's not tamed into a reciprocal relationship. It's also the basis of the most fundamental themes of fantasy. And the Google guys figured that out 15 years ago when they analyzed billions of sex fantasy searches by men and women. Men go for visual imagery, but women go for story. And the story is the same. It's innocent young woman with a lot to offer, but kind of hidden. Find some male, 5 categories of men, vampire, werewolf, pirate, surgeon, billionaire, and he's, kind of an aggressive guy, but he's capable of being turned into an intimate relationship. That's the standard female pornographic fantasy. That's pretty much the standard fantasy romance. So you can see, what a women are trying to do in that situation is they're trying to find some guy that's got the capacity for mayhem, that's under control, but who can integrate that into a productive, generous, reciprocal relationship. So, yeah.
It's fascinating because the capacity for violence and the capacity for aggression is one of the things that's actively muted in our male population.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch of reasons for that, and some of them turn into positive feedback loops, like there's sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. So there's a lot of women out there who've never had a positive relationship with any male in their life, right? And maybe not only not a positive relationship, but really a series of negative relationships. And so women like that are very leery of any expression of male ability of any sort, because they can't distinguish productive competence from arbitrary power. And because they're trying to defend themselves, because they've been hurt repeatedly, maybe they have broken families and catastrophic neighborhoods. One of the tactics that can be used in that situation is just to try to do everything you can to distance yourself as much as you can from any display of male ability. It can't be distinguished from psychopathy. It can't be distinguished from the use of power. It takes a sophisticated woman to be able to make that distinction. So the other thing you see too is that young women are much more likely to be seduced by psychopaths than older women, because the psychopaths mimic confidence. That's what narcissists do too. They're confident, and women read confidence as a marker of confidence, and that's reasonable. But that opens up it opens up a space for exploitation, because if you can mimic confidence, that's false confidence, narcissistic false confidence, then you look confident, and that works very well in young women. And of course, they get exploited by people like that, and they think, well, that's what men like.
Right.
Yeah. And then women like that, they have boys, and then they're afraid of the boys, whenever they express anything looking like masculine competence, and they basically emasculate the boys, and then the boys get scared, and then they mistreat women, and the whole thing spirals out of control. And that's where we are.
That's really what a strange place to be, isn't it?
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah. Well, unintended consequence of familial breakdown. That's a big part of it.
So we decided to have this conversation because of what's going on with you in Canada, and your clinical psychology license is in jeopardy because you have opinions about politics that they disagree with, which is a very dangerous and bizarre turn of events.
Well, it's your fault, actually. I think a week or so ago when we talked about this. But, okay, so let me give you some background here. So
I want to know how it's my fault.
I will. I'll tell you. A lot of things are your fault.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So the College of Psychology has basically levied what are equivalent to about 13 lawsuits against me simultaneously. Now, the reason I call them lawsuits is because they're actions undertaken on behalf of a complainant. Now, the complainant can be anyone anywhere in the world who complains about me for any reason. They don't have to be former clients. They don't even have to be anybody I've ever met. They don't even have to have met anybody I've ever met. So
it could be someone online.
Well, it is. All this is pretty much, all these complaints are someone online. None of them are my clients, although half of them claim to be false. And the college didn't throw out the complaints despite that. So, which is really quite interesting.
And what are the complaints?
Well, okay, let's see. One complaint is about the tweet I made about Ellen or Elliot Page, and said that a criminal physician cut off her breasts and pride was a sin. Now I'm in trouble again, so I just said the same thing. One was about Sports Illustrated cover, where they featured that overweight model, and I tweeted out not beautiful, and I guess that was something like fat shaming. I don't remember exactly what the charge was. And then I criticized Justin Trudeau and a former staff member of Justin Trudeau and Jacinda Ardern. I made a joke about her. I was going to New Zealand, and the New Zealand leftist press was freaking out, and I made this joke about bringing my alt-right trolls to New Zealand, and then I put in parentheses, or maybe they're just people who are trying to clean up their rooms. So apparently that was casting the disgrace. And then they submitted one complainant from the U.S. who submitted the entire transcript of our last discussion. So, I don't know how to defend myself against that. Apparently everything I say, everything you say too, is bringing the profession of psychology into disgrace. And I think they're most upset in that case about my comments about the inadequacy of climate models. And so, what that has to do with my clinical practice is questionable. And so, anyway, does that cover it?
Yeah, it seems like this climate is a very rigid ideology that one must subscribe to wholesale.
Yeah.
You can't have any nuanced opinions on it. You can't have any.
Well, it's a religion. It's a religion.
Yeah.
It's a partial pseudo religion, and I mean that technically. I'm going to write about this to some degree, and I'm writing a new book which will come out in November called "We Who Wrestle with God," and I'll cover that in this. But Alex Epstein wrote Possibly the Future comments about this. So the basic structure of the quasi-religious belief. And so this is the set of initial presumptions. That's the way of thinking about it. So we were talking about how ideas are structured earlier. Marxists believe that everything's about power. There's a narrative at the base of any belief system. The climate pseudo-religion is based on characterization of nature as something like a hapless, what we call a hapless, defenseless, fragile virgin. The industrial activity of mankind is characterized as something like a rapacious, power-mad, demolisher of natural virginity and beauty, and then the human being the individual is characterized as nothing but a devouring mouth whose activity runs contrary to the untrammeled beauty of the planet, and that supports the activity of the tyrannical patriarch. That's basically it. And so the reason that narrative has force is because it draws on underlying religious archetypes. And so to characterize the world properly, you do need to characterize the positive aspect of nature, because you have to live in something approximating a reciprocal harmony with nature. Because if you just leave everything, devour everything in your local landscape, then you die. So that's a bad idea. So you have to have some sense of the value of nature. Now you also have to have some sense of the fact that if you were dropped in the jungle naked in the Amazon, you'd be dead in about 48 hours. You also need a figure to characterize the negative element of nature, and that's from the environmental myth. That's part of what makes it pathological. And then with regard to the rapacious tyranny, let's say, well, any industrial system, any human organization can exploit the natural world to the point where that's not sustainable, and it can become oppressive and tyrannical. That's the evil king, ancient part of religious mythology going back as far back as we can chase it. So you need a representation of the negative aspect of society, because you send your kids to school and they kind of get turned into these cookie cutter kids, and that crushes their innate difference in beauty, and it's all the pain of having to be socialized. And you have to understand that there is this oppressive element of culture. And so, but then you should also wake up and notice that you've got the wise king too, and that means you plug in your damn toaster in the morning and the electricity works, and you go out on the street and everyone isn't rioting, and there's workmen who are knee deep in the sun trying to keep everything going, and you're not starving to just like everybody on the planet was in 1860. And so little gratitude for the positive end of the patriarchy is in order too. That's absolutely environmental duty. And then with regard to the individual, it's like, well, of course you can be a selfish, impulsive, hedonistic consumer, and you can facilitate the race of security as a consequence of that rape the planet. But by the same token, we're not a cancer on the face of the earth. We're not a virus that's mutating and taking out the planet. And we're not trapped in a melting nightmare. And you've got to give credit where it's due. And, there's an element of people, of everyone, that's noble and generous and kind and productive and capable of living in a well-ordered state in something like sustainable and productive harmony with nature. You only get half that story. Now, if you have no comprehensive underlying cultural narrative, in the case in our society, and someone offers you either half the religious story, that'll snap you up in a second. Because it helps you order your relationship with the world. It gives you a pathway too, eh? So Jean Piaget, great developmental psychologist, he called the last stage of adolescence the messianic period, the messianic stage. Now, most people don't talk much about that because they don't know what to make of Piaget's plan. He was a genius, Jean Piaget. And he said, when you're making that transition from the group identity that you're chasing as a teenager to becoming an individual, and that's not a journey everyone takes. A lot of people get lost in group identity. You're going to be looking for a pathway that's essentially heroic. And what that pathway should be is that you identify with your culture deeply, you are socialized deeply into the tradition of your culture, but you're also capable of transcending it. So then you become a culture creator as well as a disciplined member of culture. But young people need to be offered something like a vision of destiny in order to catalyze their identity. And we're very, very bad at that, except on the ideological side. So woke types come along and say, the planet's a virgin, the great father's a tyrant. You could be a hero if you just stood up to that. And the kids think, well, I'd like to do something important with my life. And so they're just caught into that immediately. But because it's a one-sided story, it's a one-sided religious story is a story.
And a great representation of that is what they've done with Greta Thunberg.
Yeah, exactly. It's so funny, we live in the delusion of a disturbed 13-year-old girl. How did that happen? And then, Greta Thunberg showed up, and I thought, oh, there we go. Now we got the 13-year-old. I feel sorry for her, because she was chased into this apocalyptic terror that we're trying to enforce on all our kids. And then you think about her position, so now she's all afraid, and her mother is facilitating that mad. And then, she announces her fear, her neurotic fear, essentially, driven by negative emotions. And, Macron said to her, oh my gosh, you're absolutely right, vows. What the hell is this girl to think? Because what she really wants is to freak out a bit, and for someone calm and reasonable to say, hey, look, the apocalypse has always been on us. It's always the case that the future has the possibility of being dreadful. But, we've conquered terrible things in the past and overcome massive obstacles, and there's no reason at all not to assume that we can do the same thing.
That's a very important point.
Well, yeah.
It's such an important point because there's never been a time ever where everything was perfect.
Well, that's for sure.
There's never been a time ever environmentally where the earth was stable. If you go being stable, currently kind of guess what the weather's going to be. But if you look at models of thousands of years, it's never been flat. It's always been up and down.
Well, the earth was an ice ball many times.
Many times.
Yeah. So yeah. Well,
Randall Carlson was saying there's been times in our distant past where the CO2 levels and the oxygen levels were so fucked up that we were close to losing all life on Earth.
Right.
And then this
see, the antithesis of that is to believe in something like the intrinsic paradisal stability of well-balanced Mother Nature.
Right.
Yeah, a bit, but no, not really. There's a lot of variability, and of course that kind of variability that's hard on people because you want stability so you don't die.
Right, but it doesn't deny that human beings have an impact on us either.
Like, no. Well, this is why, here's why we just use Lomberg. Because Lomberg's hard to craft because the forces each thing complex. Well, we don't have one problem, carbon dioxide, which is, I don't even think it's clear that carbon dioxide is actually a problem, but we can leave that aside. That'll get me in trouble with ecologists, psychologists again. But, Lomberg says about that. It's a factor, yeah. But there's lots of factors. And God only knows what the most pressing problems that confront us truly are. And I wandered through the ecological sustainability literature about 10 years ago, and I concluded a couple of things. One was that the best way forward to a sustainable planet is to make everyone who's poor rich as fast as possible. Not to put limits to growth on. Because it turns out if you get people above $5,000 a year in average GDP, they start taking long-term views of the future. Instead of scrabbling around in the dirt trying to get lunch, you're going to burn everything up around you to stay alive if you have to. Right. But if you got a bit of wealth and now you can think over, maybe a 20-year period, which is quite the damn luxury, then you actually start being concerned about, the quality, the aesthetic quality of the local environment. And so I was so excited when I found that data because I thought, this is so cool. It means that we could have our cake and eat it too. We could work really hard to provide cheap, reliable energy, at the lowest cost possible to the widest number of people worldwide. And the emergent consequence of that would be the whole planet would clean itself up. So wouldn't that be great? Because we could make our goal the eradication of absolute poverty, which we actually done pretty good at eliminating over the last 15 years, but we could really make that a goal. And then one of the consequences, inevitable consequences, would be a greener and healthier planet. And then you think, well, why aren't we doing that? That's a question, right? And I think part of the reason is I've been trying to understand the driving ideas underneath this globalist utopian tyranny that seems to be developing from the top down. And I think it's driven, at least in part, by this religious vision that I already described. That you have to construe culture itself, especially industrial culture, as the tyrannical father raping and pillaging everything in its way, which is an unbelievably dangerous way to think, too one-sided. And the idea that you have to impose limits to growth on people in order to have a sustainable planet. And that's allied with a view that probably stems all the way back to people like Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s, who really believed, truly, that maybe the planet should only have 500 million people on it, or a billion, in relative poverty, or 2 billion barely scraping by, because otherwise you're going to be wrecking everything and, controlled by some top-down authority that makes bloody well sure that no one's consuming too much. And so when I look at ideas like that first assumption, the planet has too many people on it, but I don't like to hear people say that. And when I hear that, I think, okay, buddy, who exactly are you thinking about getting rid of? Oh, well, it's not like that. It's like, yeah, it's like that.
It has to be like that.
It is absolutely like that. And so, it's easy to get all paranoid conspiracy theorists about the WEF, say, and maybe there's some utility in that, but, I don't think anybody's sitting at Davos going, well, we got to scrap 7 billion people. But if the underlying narrative is the one I just described, virginal planet, tyrannical patriarchy, and rapacious individual, and you believe, well, we're overpopulated, like Paul Ehrlich believed really literally in the mid-1960s, then how is it not going to be that the policies that you craft stemming from that narrative are colored by the belief that there's far too many people? Like, I really felt that I'd be at war for the last 6 months. And I would say it's war because what I observed happening in Europe when I was there last was that, well, you can see that, you don't have to go to Europe to see it, but it's more direct if you're there, is that it's pretty damn clear that the globalist utopians are willing to sacrifice the poor for the sake of the planet. And they're doing that by dragging energy prices up through the roof, and that means that people die. Lomberg is estimating that you maybe have to turn the thermostat down by 3 degrees, right? Save the planet. We don't have enough energy. We'll pay you not to use your electricity between 5 and 6, which is what they're doing in the UK. You turn your damn thermostat down 3 degrees, that sounds like nothing, but if you're old, that radically increases the probability that you'll get a respiratory disease and die. And if the Europeans would have had a cold winter, and that could still happen, Blomberg estimated to wipe out 135,000 people. It's like, well, you know, we just need an energy amendment. Like, what do you mean you're just doing that? So imagine the economic pyramid. There's a bunch of people at the top. They have almost all money. That's par for the course for any productive system. Any system that's productive ends up with distribution. It's like a law of nature. And then you move farther down the pyramid, so you get down to the bottom, where most of the people are, and they're barely clinging on to the edge of reality, right? It doesn't take much crisis to tip them into, you know, debt. And then you crank up energy prices. Well, what happens is you just take a bunch of those people at the bottom of the distribution, the poor that the left is so, you know, hypothetically concerned with, and they're just done. They go from barely hanging on to not hanging on. And their kids go from having some ghost of a chance of opportunity to having none. And I could see this coming. You really saw it happen in Germany and the UK, you know, where we have this absolute rat's nest of way more expensive energy. And this is where it gets extremely perverse. You know, you might say, okay, look, we have to save the future poor. And so now some of the present poor are going to have to suffer. Well, that's convenient for you if you happen not to be one of those poor people, but let's give the devil his due and say, okay. It's like, that'd be fine with me. Not really. That'd be fine with me if the consequence of your actions, raising energy prices, for example, actually produce an improvement in those things you wanted to improve. So, for example, energy is more expensive, but now the air is cleaner. But that isn't what's happened in Germany. What's happened in Germany is energy is like 5 times as expensive, and the coal plants are back on. So it's like, even by your own criteria for success, you failed, and you did it at the expense of the poor. And, you know, the World Bank estimated, I don't remember how many months ago, probably 9 months ago, that we're putting 350 million people on the brink of starvation because we're cranking energy prices up. And so for me, it's like, that's 350 million people. That's 3 times as many as the communists killed, you know, in their 6 decades of trying. And if your cure for the planet is, well, you know, we've got to put 350 million poor people in jeopardy just so that things are hypothetically better in 100 years, I think, yeah, I don't think so, Brian. And also, it's a little bit too convenient for me that your prescriptions to save the planet are accompanied by this insistence that the only way forward to that is to give you all the power. It's like, there's a bit of a moral hazard in that, don't you think? It's like, I'm just saving the planet. Give me all the power. You want to save the planet, or do you want the power? And let's put the second one first, because the probability that you're a saint or the Messiah is pretty damn low. So that's the danger of the devil's crowd.
It's a very bizarre narrative that doesn't get challenged. And I don't hear this very nuanced, complex perspective to what you're laying out right now. I don't hear that often. No, I don't hear it at all. I hear it from you and maybe a couple other people that I actively seek out. But you would think that when you're dealing with such a complex issue that you would want to see the most brilliant minds think out, how does this play out?
Yeah, like, well, okay.
What are the consequences?
So let's think about what mitigates against that. Okay, so first of all, young people are looking for a productive and visionary pathway forward. We already covered that, right? But then there's a dark side of that too, and the dark side of that for everyone is that our reputations are very important to us. They're our most crucial currency, you know, and what that means is that we're tempted to elevate our reputation in an undeserved manner. And we do that to gain social status with very little work. And so we're tilted towards being tempted by theories that provide us with an easy way forward to that. And so one is, well, I'm a good person. Well, how do I know that? Well, I'm concerned about the planet. Well, that's a complex problem, the planet, right? That's a trillion problems, not one. I'm concerned about the planet, therefore I'm good. But that's complicated, you gotta take it apart. No, you don't. You just say, well, the planet only has one problem. Well, what's that? Untrammeled industrial activity and the rapacious nature of the consumer. Okay, what's the output? Too much carbon dioxide. Okay, I'm against carbon dioxide. Well, bang, you're the Messiah, you know, with no work. And then someone like Blomberg comes along and says, hold on there, guys. we got like 30 problems, not one. And we need to rank order the problems. We need to do a differentiated analysis. And your idiot interventions are going to cause nothing but unintended consequences. And no one wants to hear that because number one, it's complicated. You've got to read the damn book and you've got to think through his arguments. And number two, well, now where are you going to get your cheap moral virtue? You can't just be the Messiah by waving the banner, waving a banner that says, I don't like carbon dioxide. And so that runs against a very, very deep narcissism. And so that's part of what stands in opposition to people, especially people like Lombard.
And that's
Couldn't find a more reasonable
by
person.
social media,
Yeah, definitely.
like greatly.
Yeah. Well, social media is a great place to garner unearned social reputation.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be gamed, and it is gamed. And we also even know the nature of the people who game it. There's a whole emergent psychological literature concentrating on dark tetrad traits. So I can walk through that a little bit. So the standard personality models that produce the big five, extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and openness, they were derived sort of with a primitive AI, that's the way of thinking about it, that looked for patterns of description across huge corpuses of linguistic data. How do people talk about each other? It turns out they talk about each other using 5 dimensions, and of course, the dimensions I just described. But the people who derived the big five didn't use evaluating descriptors. They threw anything out that looked like a value judgment. So, for example, you might say of someone, he's a good person. You might say something else, he's a malevolent person. Those descriptors weren't included in the big five corpus because they were trying to derive a model of normative personality. So, but that meant that the catalog of personality wasn't encapsulated or well defined. Now, this guy, Robert Hare, who worked at University of British Columbia as world's leading authority on psychopathy, and he interviewed hundreds and hundreds of psychopaths and was always fooled by the way. And then he had a student, Dale Paulus, who works at UBC, and Paulus developed a model of personality that's based on pathology, like on the dark side. And it's called the dark triad. Machiavellianism. That means Machiavellian is someone who, so let's say, if I was Machiavellian in our discussions, what I would have done was think, before I came here, I thought, well, what can Joe offer me? And then I think, well, how can I play Joe with my language so I'm most likely to get what I'm, the narrow, repulsive thing that I'm aiming at right now. Well, that's how Machiavellian operates. A narcissist, that's the next part of the dark triad, is someone who wants social status without doing any of the work. They want all the attention. If you're dating a narcissist or in a relationship with a narcissist, they'll alienate all your family members and your friends so that they get all the attention. And that'll just be the first of the games they play with you.
Yeah.
Then you have psychopathy, and the psychopaths are parasitical predators. And so the predator will take whatever you've got, and the parasite will live off you. And then here's a parasitical ideological statement. Property is fed. That's classic Marxist approach. Why would you say that? Well, if I want to live off you, the way I'm going to justify that ethically is by claiming, well, Joe, look how privileged you are. You've got all this money. You just took that from the oppressed. And if I'm manipulating you so that I get some of your money, that's only just because, first of all, it's exactly what you did. And second of all, well, why not spread some of that wealth around? So that's Machiavellianism, narcissism, psychopathy, dark triad. They've expanded that recently to add another dimension that was missing, sadism. And the sadist takes positive delight in causing pain to others. And the love culture, LULZ, the love culture online is a culture of sadistic Machiavellian narcissism, psychopath.
Lows, meaning
It's
like people are joking around and shit posting.
Yeah, I did it for the low. It's the
Right.
plural of LOL, laugh out loud. But like, if you look at the Urban Dictionary, for example, the definition of lulls is positive delight in the suffering of others. Yes, and bloody well, social media facilitates that.
I never thought of lulls as being.
In and of itself, it's not a sufficient one, right? You have to have like 6 or 7 things going on before it's clear that you're manifesting this underlying tetrad personality trait. Like if you use an odd acronym in your phone, now joke or something. This is a habitual pattern of doing nothing but provoking people online and using deception and lies to do it to attract attention to yourself. You know, it has to be a very consistent pattern. But Paulos, first of all, and his crew of researchers and people who've been influenced by him have laid out this four-dimensional structure of the dark side, let's say. And they've shown that hyper users of social media, Instagram, for example, and people who do a lot of anonymous shit posting are characterized by, you know, what would you call it, domination by those four traits. And part of the reason for that, this is very, very dangerous to our whole society, I think, is that you got to ask yourself what keeps the psychopaths under control in the normal population. And the answer seems to be, especially on the male side, is that narcissistic aggressive men get put in their place by non-narcissistic aggressive men. And that usually has to do with something like the threat of physical intervention. You know how it is if you get a bunch of guys together. I can make a joke about you, you know, and I could even make a joke that was to sort of put you down. But the joke would have to be funny. You'd have to have the opportunity to reciprocate, and you'd have to believe that I was doing it in good spirit. Because if I just used the opportunity to, you know, stick the knife in, we're not going to get along with each other very long. And we know that, and men know that when they talk to each other. And so part of what keeps dialogue among men civilized is the possibility that it won't be civilized if it's too selfish. Everybody knows that. But there is none of that online. Because anybody can post anything about anyone, no matter how denigrating and derisive. Especially if they do it anonymous and do zero consequence. In fact, quite the opposite. If they're good at it, they get a lot of attention, and the social media companies will monetize them. And so not only is it not inhibited, it's actually facilitated. This isn't a trivial problem, because if the psychopaths multiply enough, they take the whole society out. So I think virtualization enables psychopathy. And it's worse than just the trolling bit. That's bad enough, because it pollutes political dialogue and it makes everyone think that everything is more unstable than it really is. But online criminality is actually terrible. Right? You know, I don't think there's an old person in North America who isn't being targeted by some gang of psychopaths who, you know, documented all of their interests in their locale, and who knows how much money is in their bank account, and who's doing everything they possibly can at every second to leverage access to it. That's just happening continually.
So it's certainly algorithms, right, for a lot of people that get trapped into these sort of situations where people are constantly throwing at them things that are opportunities for them to either make money or get this or
get a refund.
Get a refund.
You bet. Or they befriend them. You know, they get it in, and some lonely old character who's not functioning cognitively quite like he used to, you know, he gets sucked in by someone pretending to be his friend and offered a great investment opportunity. Yeah. And it's very, very, very difficult to track this sort of thing online. So you get the real enabling of the criminals, because how the hell, if they're anonymous, how the hell do you keep them, you know, how do you hold them to account? But, and then the secondary derivation of something like trolling, that's really not so good either, because if the psychopathic, narcissistic, Machiavellian sadists are dominating the political discourse, then ordinary people look at that and think, oh my God, everything's going to hell. Everyone's really extreme, and really, it's a non-random sample. And so, you know, I can really see this in my own life, you know, because if you just looked at me virtually, you think like I was the world's most embattled person in some way, you know, maybe not the world's most, but I'm up in the top 10. But in my real life, then that, like, I don't have any problems. You know, I go around from town to town or from city to city, and every interaction I have with people on the street is positive. They either don't know me, which is fine, or they do, and then we have a positive interaction. And I've only had like 3 negative interactions with people in real life in the last 6 years. Like, they stand out because they're not fun, but they're extremely rare. But online, it's like 60% of the people oppose Jordan Peterson. It's not even 1%. So we're building a virtual world that doesn't sample the real world very well, and that's not much different than building a delusion. So not good. Very unsettling.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, certainly Twitter before Elon Musk.
Yeah, well, Twitter's better, but it's still quite the snake pit.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I think might be done about that. Yeah, I don't think that I've made this claim on Twitter that there's something cowardly about anonymous posting. And I'm not going to retract that because I believe that in 99% of the cases that's true. Now people say, well, if you're a whistleblower, you have to be anonymous. And what about people in totalitarian states or in a company? Well, say that's the whistleblowing problem. I think, yeah, 1% of anonymous posters are heroes, but like 80% of them are Machiavellians. And so,
well, and there's the fact that people that don't want to get in trouble at work.
yeah, I know. Well, that's kind of the whistleblower problem.
But not even whistleblowers. I mean, people that just have opinions that
might get them in trouble with the College of Psychologists in Ontario, for example. Yeah, I know. So, well, I think one of the ways of handling that technically, what I'd like to see happen at Twitter, for example, not that I'm in a position to know because I know it's complicated, is I think the anonymous types should be separated from the real people. So you can go visit them and see what they have to say, but the verified people, their comments are either at the top or in a different place. Because I don't think that we can set up a playable game online when the anonymous trolls have the same rights as the verified responsible users. I also think, and I don't know what you think about this, Joe, but let's say you want to be a whistleblower, you want to say something that's going to get you in trouble at work. So you want to do it anonymously. Like, maybe you're shirking your responsibility. Because maybe you have a responsibility. And I could be persuaded alternatively, but maybe you have a responsibility if you have something to say it in your own voice and put yourself behind it. And maybe you're taking the easy way out by not doing that. I mean, I don't want to say about every single person who posts anonymously, but tyranny emerges when normal, honest people are now afraid to say what they think. And when the tyranny is complete in a totalitarian state, no one ever says what they think about anything. Everyone lies all the time. And I see part of the pathway to that, the unwillingness of ordinary people to take the consequences of their truthful speech. And I also think that's detrimental to them because I think that you find the adventure in your life. I think this is certainly true of you. You find the adventure in your life by standing behind your words. Like that's you, right? Those are your words. If you're telling the truth, that's actually you. And there's going to be consequences. And sometimes they're going to be negative. But do you really think that the consequences of telling the truth in your own voice are negative? You think the world's structured like that? Jesus, that's a dismal view, man.
Well, it depends on the amount of autonomy you have. It depends on the amount of resources you have.
Yeah.
I mean, let's take, for example, nurses. Nurses who had contracted COVID during the pandemic and had developed natural immunity. There was already studies that showed that natural immunity was superior to the immunity that was imparted by the vaccine, but yet they were being mandated to take this vaccine. And a lot of them had some serious apprehensions about it that were logical, based on people that they knew that had adverse reactions. And now we're finding out more and more how common those adverse reactions were. Now, if these women stepped up or these men who are nurses stepped up and said something about it publicly, it would be fine.
Yeah, well, look, when I was working as a clinician, I had lots of clients who were in that position. They're at work and they're being tyrannized by sometimes it was DEI types and sometimes it was diversity, inclusivity, and equity. The woke ideologues who were coming for them and not letting them say what they wanted to say politically. And sometimes they're just being tyrannized by garden variety narcissists. Their bosses were that sort.
Yeah.
And it was crushing them. And, it's easy to say to people like that, well, just stand up to your boss. But they often were rather constrained in their employment opportunities and they had families. And so you can't tell people, well, just go shoot off your mouth stupidly, get fired and taken out and mobbed and let your family starve. That's a pretty dumb strategy. But what we would always do in the therapeutic endeavor with someone in a situation like that was to situate themselves in their life so that they could afford to abide by their own truth. And so that might mean if you're in a job, let's say, where you don't have freedom of expression, you get your resume or your CV polished up so that if necessary, you could make a lateral move relatively quickly. Maybe you send out some job applications just to test the market. And if you're not marketable, maybe you pop up your skills. And then maybe if you're in a position where you're vulnerable because someone else has got control over your tongue, maybe you work real hard to put some other ground under your feet so that you can't be taken out so easily. Like when I opposed the Bill C-16 in Canada, the mandatory pronoun bill. Like I knew, first of all, I knew that that would cause a psychological epidemic. I told the Senate that back in 2017. Said, you guys don't know what you're doing here. You're going to confuse a lot of adolescent young women, and for every girl you hypothetically save who has body dysmorphia, and that'll be a vanishingly small number of people who actually save, you're going to doom like 300. Of course, that's exactly what's happened. That's why the Tavistock clinic shut down in the UK, you know, and so there was that. But I also had set myself up, you know. So I had 3 streams of income. I had my university salary, I had a clinical practice, and I had a business. And that wasn't accidental. You know, I knew from my clinical practice that if you wanted to say what you had to say, you had to put yourself in a position where you couldn't be easily taken out by the mob or the tyrant. And then I would say, well, if you're not in a position where you can afford to say what you have to say, then that's an indication that you haven't positioned yourself optimally existentially, haven't positioned yourself optimally in life. Your fundamental, your foundation is too weak. And so, you know, maybe it'll take you 3 years to fix that, you know, so that now you're grounded firmly so that a casual objection from your boss or even being fired isn't going to take you out. It's not like that's easy. But I mean, abiding by the truth isn't easy. The only thing, but it's a lot more preferable than abiding by falsehood. That's the problem, right? Of course, abiding by the truth isn't easy, obviously. But, you know, what sort of devil do you let into your head if you abide by falsehood? And some of that might be just not saying what you have to say. That's not just, you know. Mostly we regard sins of commission as more egregious than sins of omission. You know, an outright lie is worse than just failure to say what you know to be the truth. But when enough people are silent about things they know they have something to say about, something about, then you have a tyranny. And so, well, we haven't sorted through all this, you know, very well in our society, but I think it's morally incumbent on all of us to set up our lives so that we can afford to tell the truth. And if you can't, well, then you think, no, you haven't got the hatches battened down, right? The walls of your towers, your fort aren't high enough. You're not properly armed, and you should be, because you know the mob's coming for you, and so is the chaos of nature. You bloody well better be prepared. And so I think if you're anonymous, you're depriving yourself of the necessity to put yourself in a position where you can tell the truth. Now, think about what happened to you. Now, you tell me what you think about this. I mean, I've been watching you for a long time, and it's quite remarkable seeing the impact that you've had that keeps increasing across time. You know, but my experience with you is that, you know, you have your opinions, your perspective, and you'll put them forward, but mostly what you